They thought the courtroom fireworks were already over. But what just dropped has lit the fuse all over again. Because just when everyone thought Blake Lively had played all her cards, just when it seemed like the evidence exchange phase was behind them, just when the legal game board looked frozen in place, Justin Baldoni walks into court and tells the judge something no one was prepared to hear, that Blake Lively didn't just stall or delay, she outright refused to exchange crucial evidence at the exact moment when it could have mattered most, and now suddenly she's demanding everything, as if the clock can be turned back and the rules bent in her favor. This isn't just a change of heart, this is a calculated pivot at the highest stakes possible, a move that has stunned legal experts and even rattled a few of her own supporters. The silence in the courtroom was thick, the weight of the words dropping heavier with each sentence. As Baldoni's legal team laid out their version of events, the refusal wasn't minor, it wasn't procedural, it was a full-on blockade of information that could have shaped the case months ago, and yet here we are with Blake asking for access to every shred of material she once said no to. The question hanging in the air is why, what shifted behind the scenes, what pressure, what whisper, what hidden hand made her flip her strategy so dramatically? The attorneys didn't flinch. They knew this moment was coming. The drama wasn't just about the legal rules, it was about what this looks like to the public, the optics, the narrative. Because in high-profile Hollywood cases, the story you tell outside the courtroom can matter just as much as the one you argue inside, and now both sides are racing to seize control of that story before the next round begins. The air in that courtroom was so tense. It almost felt like the walls themselves were leaning in to hear what was about to be said. Because this wasn't just any procedural motion. This was a declaration that could rewrite the narrative of the entire case. And Justin Baldoni's team knew exactly what they were doing. They didn't waste time with polite small talk or routine formalities. They dove headfirst into the accusation, laying it bare in front of the judge in a way that left no room for ambiguity. They said that when the time came for both parties to exchange key evidence, something that should have been routine in a case of this scale, Blake Lively's side flatly declined. They didn't ask for an extension, they didn't negotiate for conditions, they simply refused. And that refusal wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a strategic roadblock. Because without that evidence, Baldoni's team was left preparing their arguments in the dark, piecing together whatever they could from secondary sources and public records, while knowing that the most critical material was sitting locked away untouched in Blake's possession. And now, months later, after deadlines have passed, after court schedules have been rearranged, after legal strategy has been built around the absence of that information, Blake's team suddenly wants it all. They're not just asking for a peek, they're demanding full access to every document, every email, every file they once turned their backs on. And the way Baldoni's lawyers framed it, this wasn't a simple change of strategy. This was an attempt to rewrite history, to act as if the clock could be wound back to a point where that evidence was still fresh and relevant. But here's the thing about court deadlines. They aren't just ink on paper, they're the backbone of fairness. They make sure that neither side can game the system by hiding the ball until the last possible moment. The judge listened, silently jotting down notes. But you could see from the slight furrow in their brow that this was no small matter. The weight of this accusation hung heavy, because if what Baldoni's team was saying could be backed up with the right documentation, this could put Blake in a far worse position than she may have anticipated. Her refusal would no longer look like just another tactical move. It would start to look like obstruction, and obstruction in a case this high profile doesn't just risk legal penalties, it can damage reputations in ways no PR firm can clean up. From outside the gallery, a few reporters exchanged glances and scribbled in their notebooks, because they knew this was the kind of twist that could dominate headlines by morning. The idea that the glamorous, carefully managed image of Blake Lively could be chipped away, not by scandalous rumors but by dry legal filings and missed deadlines, was almost too perfect for the press to resist. Baldoni himself sat quietly beside his attorneys, hands clasped on the table, eyes fixed forward. He wasn't smirking, he wasn't gloating, he knew better than to let the cameras catch him looking too pleased, because in the court of public opinion, victory can turn into arrogance in a heartbeat. But make no mistake, inside his team's camp, they could feel the momentum shift. This was the kind of revelation that could make jurors see the case differently, that could make them wonder why someone would refuse to share evidence unless they feared what it might reveal. And the beauty of it, from Baldoni's perspective, was that he didn't even have to accuse her of wrongdoing outright. The refusal itself was enough to plant the seed. The murmurs grew louder as Blake's lead attorney finally rose to respond. There was no hesitation, no flipping through notes. They had come prepared for this moment. And their defense was as bold as it was risky. They claimed that the refusal months ago had been perfectly justified, that the evidence in question had been deemed irrelevant under their interpretation of the case's scope, and that sharing it at the time would have been a waste of resources. But here's where it got messy. Because now by asking for everything they had previously rejected, they were implicitly admitting that maybe it was relevant after all. And that contradiction was like blood in the water for Baldoni's team. The attorney's voice never wavered, but the logic of their argument felt like it was stretched to the breaking point. They tried to pivot, shifting the narrative toward the idea that the recent developments in the case had changed the context and that in light of these changes, the evidence had taken on new importance, but Baldoni's lawyers were ready for that. They shot back that the supposed changes were nothing more than the natural unfolding of the case, that nothing had truly shifted except Blake's calculation of what she could gain by getting her hands on the material. She once refused it. The back and forth lasted nearly an hour, each side trading points, like boxers circling each other in the ring. The judge occasionally stepped in to ask clarifying questions, but for the most part let the attorneys play out their strategies in full. And as the arguments wound down, it became clear that this wasn't going to be resolved. With a quick ruling, the judge announced they would take the matter under advisement, review the filings from both sides, and issue a decision at a later date. And that delay was both a blessing and a curse for Baldoni's camp, because while it kept the spotlight on Blake's reversal, it also gave her team time to regroup and spin the story in the media. And if there's one thing Blake Lively has proven over her career, it's that she knows how to control a narrative, or at least she used to. Because now, with court reporters live tweeting every development and online commentators dissecting every contradiction, her old playbook might not work anymore. And somewhere deep down, she had to know that this wasn't just about winning in court anymore. This was about credibility. And once you lose that, it's almost impossible to get it back. And as the judge looked over the notes, the courtroom seemed to freeze in a strange silence. Because this was not just another scheduling dispute, this was the kind of moment that hinted at deeper maneuvering, a chess game playing out in public view. And Justin Baldoni's team knew it. They weren't here to make noise for the sake of headlines. They had a strategy, and that strategy depended on one thing: making it impossible for Blake Lively to keep both her image and her legal advantage intact. And the way they were doing it was methodical. Point by point, they reminded the court that months ago, an evidence exchange had been arranged and agreed upon under oath, that the timelines had been set, the formats decided, the stipulations clear. And yet Blake Lively's side had walked away from it. They didn't just delay it. They had outright declined to provide what was required, without offering a legal basis strong enough to hold up under scrutiny. And now, in a twist that had even court regulars raising their eyebrows, she was demanding the very same materials in full, claiming that she was the one deprived of fairness. And here's the part that turned this from a procedural hiccup into something much bigger. Baldoni's attorney wasn't just opposing the request, he was framing it as an attempt to rewrite history, painting a picture for the judge of a party who had strategically withheld cooperation early on, only to later claim victimhood and demand the benefits of compliance without the responsibilities. And if you think that didn't land heavily in the courtroom, you'd be mistaken. Because each time the attorney spoke, the gallery shifted in their seats, some even exchanging glances like they understood the subtext. This was no longer about a single discovery request. This was about credibility, and about whether a party could game the system and still expect the court's sympathy. And the way the lawyer leaned in toward the podium, lowering his voice as if to let the words sink in, only amplified the tension, because he wasn't just arguing law. He was telling a story, one that the judge couldn't ignore. He reminded everyone that this wasn't the first time Blake Lively's team had made moves that looked cooperative on the surface, but in practice created delays, obstacles, and confusion for the opposing side. He brought up prior filings, where language was carefully crafted to give the appearance of compliance while sidestepping actual obligations, and with each reference, the judge's expression grew more fixed, more calculating, as if mentally bookmarking every example for later review. But here's where the twist came in. The attorney didn't just hammer on the past. He shifted to the potential consequences if the court now rewarded this reversal. He argued that it would send a message to every litigant watching that you could ignore your obligations at the start and then later flip the table, demanding everything you had once refused. And the worst part, he said, is that it would incentivize bad faith tactics across the board if the court was seen as condoning it. Now, you could feel the unease ripple through the space, because even those not directly invested in this case could see the wider implications. And yet, while the legal battle raged on, the narrative outside the courtroom was even more potent. Social media threads spun theories about why Lively's side would have taken such a risk. Some claimed it was arrogance, others saw it as desperation, and then there were the ones who suspected it was part of a larger game, a way to keep certain information from surfacing until it could be spun in the right way. And Baldoni's camp leaned into that suspicion without saying it outright. The subtext of their argument was clear. If Lively really wanted transparency, why refuse it when the timelines were fair and agreed upon? Why wait until the optics could be controlled before suddenly demanding access? And that question hung in the air unanswered. And heavy, the judge's pen tapping lightly on the bench, the sound sharp in the otherwise still room. Baldoni himself sat quietly beside his counsel, eyes fixed forward, not flinching as the opposing side tried to paint him as the one benefiting unfairly, but his silence wasn't weakness. It was the silence of someone letting their lawyer do the talking, knowing the points were landing exactly as intended. And when the judge finally broke the pause to ask Lively's counsel to respond, the air shifted again, because now the burden was on them to explain not just the procedural choice but the appearance of bad faith. And while they spoke about unforeseen complications and shifting timelines, their explanations lacked the crispness and certainty of Baldoni's team. And that difference in delivery mattered. It mattered because in high-profile cases like this, one perception can become reality in every observer, both inside and outside. The courtroom was already shaping their own conclusion. But here's the thing about court battles, especially ones wrapped in celebrity and media glare. They aren't decided in a single dramatic moment. They're decided in the accumulation of these small skirmishes where credibility is either built up or chipped away. And in this round, at least, it was clear which side had the momentum. And yet the danger for Baldoni's team was just as real, because pushing too hard could risk alienating the judge and making it look like they were trying to score media points instead of pursuing justice. So they walked the line carefully, each argument tied back to legal precedent, each example backed by documented exchanges, each suggestion of bad faith wrapped in the language of protecting the integrity of the court process. And as they wrapped up, the room felt different, like everyone knew this case had just shifted slightly in tone and direction, and whatever happened next would not just be about evidence, it would be about trust. And whether the court believed Blake Lively's shifting positions were strategy or simple oversight. Though in cases like these, simple oversight is the least believable excuse of Allen. Now the courtroom air felt heavier than ever. The hushed murmurs rippled like small waves across the gallery. Every eye trained on the exchange unfolding between the attorneys. As Justin Baldoni's side meticulously laid out the pattern, the missed deadlines, the strategic delays, the seemingly deliberate refusals to participate in the basic exchange of evidence. And what made it more explosive was that the paper trail did not lie. There were dated emails politely requesting specific documents, clear paper filings showing offers to coordinate on discovery schedules, and even the judge's own orders urging cooperation. Yet here Baldoni's lawyer was forced to explain to the court that while his client had met every deadline and submitted every requested piece of evidence on time, the other side had stalled, dodged, and in some cases outright refused, and then weeks later had the audacity to demand those very same materials back, as if they had not been given the chance in the first place. This was not just about evidence, this was about credibility, about respect for the court, and about whether someone could manipulate the system through delay tactics until public opinion or pressure tilted in their favor. Because in high-profile cases like this, the courtroom is only one battlefield, the media is another. And every headline, every leak, every vague post on social media can subtly push the public toward one narrative and away from another. Baldoni's legal team made sure to underscore that point, reminding the judge that this was not a standard dispute between two private citizens. This was a case watched by millions, dissected in real time across news outlets and internet forums alike, and that meant every procedural decision, every delay had ripple effects beyond the walls of the courthouse. A late exchange of evidence here, a refusal to provide a witness statement, there was not just a legal inconvenience, it was ammunition in a public relations war. And the longer one side could withhold key materials, the longer they could control the story without fear of contradiction. It was here that the words from Baldoni's lawyer landed like a heavy stone. Your Honor, justice delayed is justice denied, and in this case the delay is being used as a weapon. As the judge leaned back in her chair, hands steepled, eyes narrowing slightly, the entire room seemed to sense the gravity of the moment, because if the court accepted Baldoni's version of events, then it wasn't just a procedural hiccup, it was a calculated strategy that could amount to a breach of the rules designed to keep trials fair. The opposing counsel, of course, was ready with their rebuttal, claiming the delays were due to scheduling conflicts, administrative confusion, and the high volume of material to be reviewed. But even as those words were spoken, you could feel the skepticism in the room. The timeline didn't match up, the explanations sounded too convenient, and the contrast between the meticulous documentation on Baldoni's side and the vague claims from the other was impossible to ignore. And then came the real twist. Baldoni's lawyer revealed that certain pieces of evidence now being demanded by the opposing side were the exact same materials they had previously rejected. during earlier negotiations not only rejected but in some cases openly mocked as irrelevant. Yet now, with the trial date inching closer, they wanted every bit of it and wanted it urgently, as though some shift in strategy or some internal panic had set in, perhaps a realization that without those documents, their narrative would crumble, perhaps a desperate bid to patch holes in their case. Before the scrutiny of cross-examination tore it apart, the sudden reversal was not lost on the judge, and you could see her pen jotting notes slowly, deliberately. Spectators to leaned forward, sensing that this was no longer just a procedural motion. Hearing this was about to become an exposure of deeper tactics, the kind of tactics that when revealed could tarnish reputations beyond repair, and in a case involving public figures like Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni, reputation was currency. In fact, in some ways it was more valuable than any legal win or loss, because while a verdict could be appealed, a stained public image was nearly impossible to fully restore. Baldoni's lawyer hammered that home, pointing out how his client had been subjected to weeks of speculation and whisper campaigns, while the other side sat on evidence that could have clarified or debunked those rumors if they had been released on time. As the arguments deepened, the tension between the teams became almost visible, the way they avoided each other's gaze, the clipped tone of voice, the occasional shake of the head from Baldoni himself, and Blake Lively sitting poised, but with a stiffness that betrayed the strain she was under. The reality was that both sides knew this hearing could set the tone for the rest of the trial. If the judge ruled that Baldoni's team was right, the court could impose sanctions or strict deadlines, forcing the other side to finally hand over what they had been holding back. But if the judge accepted the opposing narrative, it would give them more leeway to control the pace of the case and perhaps continue shaping the story outside of court. At one point, Baldoni's lawyer turned directly to address the elephant in the room, the celebrity factor. He acknowledged that in any case involving high-profile names, there is an unavoidable temptation to litigate through the press, but he argued that the court had a duty to resist that temptation and to ensure that the trial was decided on evidence presented here, and not on a storyline crafted for public consumption. To do otherwise, he warned, was to allow the judicial process itself to become another stage for performance and manipulation. And perhaps the most telling moment came when Baldoni's lawyer recounted a specific incident where a critical piece of communication from a key witness had been requested months ago, ignored without explanation, and then suddenly referenced by the other side in emotion as though they had possessed it all along. This was not just frustrating, he argued, it was fundamentally unfair, because it deprived his client of the chance to properly prepare for that witness's testimony. The judge's brows were upon at that detail, and you could sense the weight of it settling in the room, because fairness is the cornerstone of the trial process, and to undermine it, whether intentionally or through neglect, was to erode the very foundation of justice. Deeper into their positions, but through it all, one thing became increasingly clear. The judge was not going to let this slide without scrutiny. The questions she asked grew sharper, more pointed, less about surface excuses and more about timelines and specifics. The opposing counsel fumbled once or twice on those specifics, and each time Baldoni's lawyer seized the moment, reinforcing the pattern they had been trying to paint from the start, that this was not coincidence, this was not bad luck, this was a choice that spoke volumes about how the other side intended to fight this case. And as the gavel finally came down, signaling a brief recess, it was obvious to everyone in the room that whatever decision the judge made next would echo far beyond the courthouse. And so it comes to this: after weeks of whispers behind courtroom doors, after filings flew back and forth like daggers wrapped in paper, after statements that felt less like arguments and more like declarations of war, the dust is starting to settle, but not in the way anyone expected. Because what this case has done is not simply pit to Hollywood names against each other. It has cracked open a window into a system that was never meant to be exposed, and for Justin Baldoni, this is no longer just about a single piece of evidence. This is about the principle of fairness, about the idea that when one side plays by the rules and the other chooses to dance around them, the whole playing field tilts, and no amount of celebrity polish can hide that tilt. And for Blake Lively, this battle was supposed to be another performance, a chance to control the narrative. But somewhere between declining the exchange of evidence and now demanding access to it all, she crossed a line, and the court noticed, the public noticed, and whether she admits it or not, her legal strategy now feels like a desperate pivot rather than a master plan. The filings tell one story, but the body language in court tells another. And every time her lawyer leans in to argue about why they should get everything they once refused, you can feel the tension in the room tighten like a rope being pulled in opposite directions. The judge is watching, the press is circling, and the public is reading between every redacted line, and Justin Baldoni is standing his ground. with the kind of calm that only comes when you know the truth is on your side. He is letting the facts do the work while his opponent scrambles to explain why yesterday's no has turned into today's yes, and in the end, this may not just be a question of who gets access to what, it may become a turning point in how celebrity disputes are handled in court, because if a judge rules that you cannot refuse an exchange and then demand it later, it sends a message that even in Hollywood, where stories can be rewritten with a single phone call, the law still matters. And so the question now is not whether this fight will end, it is how much damage will be left behind when it does, because reputations are already fraying, relationships inside the industry are shifting, and when the final ruling comes down, the side that loses will not just lose in court, they will lose in the court of public opinion too, and that might be the real verdict. The one you cannot appeal, the one that follows you into every meeting, every script negotiation, every interview. And for Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni, that moment is coming faster than either of them expected.